All right, what we're going to do today is talk about the ecology and the circular economy. Um, what I'd like to do first, however, is to talk in a little bit more detail about the life cycle. Primarily do that because it's an area that people tend to either misunderstand or confuse or not necessarily identify in a proper way. So in a general sense, and I realize everyone's product is going to be different and it doesn't necessarily easily fall into these categories, but nonetheless, many products removal of the materials from the earth, whether it's mining, harvesting, whatever the extraction process, fishing, whatever the extraction process is, it's simply that. Supply chain then is literally the creation of the input components, provision of needed components, again, usually market available commodities, and they can be used for a number of different products. Primary manufacturing is usually the creation of the key component of the provide up their programs. That can either be in what they would identify as their supply chain or part and parcel of what that company does. Secondary manufacturing is usually the assembly of all those different parts, but either the key component along with other items that essentially go around that. And again, it can be the very simple or very complex products. Packaging, of course, is just provided to protect and promote the product, as well as protection. Distribution is just the transport of the product from manufacturer to consumer in a number of different modes. And consumption is naturally the use of the product. And then, of course, disposal, recycling, reuse. And this is really where you get into the issues of the circular economy. Industrial ecology usually identifies itself from extraction through distribution, the supply chain. So the supply chain becomes very critical and it's very complex. And so the introduction of the circular economy is by no means a simple task. Giving some examples for minerals and fossil fuels, mining, drilling, blasting, crushing, of course, agriculture, planting, fertilizing, irrigating, of course, harvesting is really the essence of extraction. Supply chain, chemicals, the building blocks of the final component, metals, basic forms, ingots, bars, agriculture, stripping husks, whatever it requires to get the material into a notional state. Primary manufacturing for metals, milling, refining, smelting. For chemicals, it can be the reactions, mixing, distillation, crystallization, evaporation, all those things that essentially identify the key component of your product. For secondary manufacturing, for metals, machining, welding, stamping, drawing, welding, plating, all of those different processes are part and parcel of what you would see in the secondary manufacturing. For plastics, it can be blow molding, injection, molding itself, thermoforming, essentially providing you with a identifiable function. Computers, all of those are bringing those different component parts together to form a single product. For packaging, bagging, boxing, and closing, distribution, as I said, different modes of transport. Consumption depends on the product. Either it's something that's used always, or it's a single-use consumptive endpoint. And then, of course, with disposal, you have the classic environmental impacts of emissions to air, water, and land. And hopefully, with the circular economy, you'll find recycling and reuse and recovery for future use chain into the manufacturing system is really what you're trying to accomplish here. Now, again, recognizing there have been problems in the past, I am going to essentially state the obvious, but let's go through ice cream. So extraction, of course, is milking the cow. Supply chain can be provisions of sugar, salt, all the other components that go to ice cream. Primary manufacturing can be homogenization, pasteurization of the milk. And secondary manufacturing is literally mixing packaging. You put it in the half-gallon or otherwise sized containers. Distribution, shipping to distribution centers, regional centers, and then, of course, the supermarkets or ice cream stores or stands. Consumption is naturally eating the ice cream. And, of course, the disposal is, it winds up in their sinks from your excretion. But there's packaging, of course, and then the packaging can be recovered. And that's, of course, the essence of what we're trying to accomplish for this course. Cotton shirt, pesticides, herbicides, water, land, human activity, machinery. Supply chain, you clean and screen the raw cotton, usually extracting seeds and other debris. You create cotton thread. You can procure dyes, sizing agents. For primary manufacturing, you develop the cloth, weaving, dyeing. Secondary manufacturing, cut and sell the parts. Packaging, putting it into a container, some sort of plastic bag usually. Distribution, you ship it to stores or perhaps directly to customers. And then consumption, wash and wear the shirt. And you recycle, hopefully, you're done with it, you pass it on to somebody else, goodwill, to be recovered and reused, either reprocessed or literally just refurbished. Let me go to crayons. And again, just trying to give examples so you have an idea what is possible. For Crayola crayons, paraffin wax, obviously from petroleum, and color pigment. The paraffin wax is shipped to Crayola, and the pigments come from different sources, usually natural or man-made. So in this one, extraction is petroleum extraction. Primary manufacturing is to, again, blend those two together, prepare liquid wax and colors. Secondary manufacturing, pouring the wax into molds, packaging, wrap paper on the crayons, put the crayons in the boxes, shipping them to stores. Consumption is color with crayons. You can recover unused crayons. Not a lot of this done, but it is a thought, it's a possibility. Copper wires, again, ore extraction. You extract the copper from the ore. You prepare copper rolls, you extrude a wire, you wrap the wire in plastic or wooden cores, ship this through its life cycle, and it's about to be demolished. You can go in and recover that copper and reuse it. Aluminum foil, very similar. Extract the alumina, you extract the alumina from the ore, you extract aluminum from alumina. Secondaries to create the product, usually an ingot or a sheet like this. Wrap the product, ship to the stores. Consumption is used in restaurants, used in the homes. And of course, hopefully you'll be able to recover that aluminum. Well, it's not done as much as it could or should be because usually you have recyclable product. Let me talk about polyester. This is interesting only because in many cases in past classes, the student will talk about extraction and then you have, polyethylene terephthalate. It's like a lot of steps in between, and you need to essentially make sure you identify this because there are real opportunities for enhanced efficiencies in those steps. So let's see if we can't focus on that. Polyester, of course, represented by the ester group, CO-O group. Polyesters display a wide range of properties and practical applications, permanent press fabrics, soft drink bottles, compact discs, rubber tires, enamel paints, a lot of different uses for this class of compounds. And of course, with that, you have a family of polymers. You have both aliphatic and aromatic, whether it's polyhydroxybutyrate, hydroxyvalerate, PHpylene terephthalate. All of those essentially are components of that family of polymers, and they all have distinct uses. Now, again, getting back to PET, US recycling rates are about a third, 31%. In the EU, they're much higher. But again, PET is produced by a polymerization of ethylene glycol and terephthalic acid. Ethylene glycol is a colorless liquid obtained from ethylene via ethylene oxide, formed from paraxylene, it's an oxidation of xylene there, and it converts that methyl group to a OH group. When heated together under the influence of different chemical catalysts, you're going to get the combination of ethylene glycol and terephthalic acid to produce the PET. It is molten, it's viscous, very thick, has a high viscosity, and it can be spun together to create fibers or solidified for later processing, such as with bottles. Now, this is where what I've had in the past is the students, they'll identify petroleum as a starting material, so that's good, but then they'll go directly to the bottle or the thread and skipping all those other steps. And that's really where the essence of what you can do with industrial ecology can be about. So first of all, you get steam cracking, so you break down large hydrocarbons down to ethylene. You then convert ethylene to ethylene oxide. Ethylene oxide plus water creates ethylene glycol, and you use, of course, xylene from catalytic reforming. With these, you make the polyethylene terephthalate from the combination of ethylene glycol and terephthalate. You spin that into thread or solid material if it's going to go into bottles. You thread the material to close plastic, of course. Distribution to stores, consumption, wash and wear the shirt, and hopefully recycle and recover. So that's the essence of the supply chain overview. And I did this now because I think it's usually the supply chain that is most misunderstood and overlooked. Sometimes because the complexity is almost overwhelming. And I think you have to understand that there are a lot of different options. If you go back through a supply chain, you'll see that you'll have, a major company will have 10 to hundreds of primary suppliers, and so on and so forth. So it can be a rather significant number of different steps that allow you to obtain that one material that you'll then use in your product. Again, especially for more complex products. So that's really the essence of it. It is really all about the complexity of the supply chain in ways that many companies really don't really understand. They fail to grasp, and they almost are oblivious to it. They almost don't care. As long as they can get the key primary ingredient they need to come into their manufacturing steps, that's somebody. However, there have been issues, there have been problems that are forcing companies to look more closely into their supply chain and understand that complexity and see if they can't take steps to improve the efficiencies of that. Again, to make sure that there is an effort to eliminate waste, not just in their own operations. Obviously, companies have morphed from one to the other as they merged and reformed. We did conduct company-wide life cycle assessments, which demonstrated the impact of the supply chain. a major effort, but nonetheless very, very critical. I did provide funding headcount to put bodies into procurement, which was relatively successful until I said, look, we've now demonstrated its utility, its value. I pulled the resources out, and the person involved with procurement could care. So that was probably no more than 6 to 9 months. It was a relatively short hiatus. What happened, of course, was that Walmart woke up and made demands on their supply chain. And we happened to be, GSK happened to be part of that supply chain. So all of a sudden, the procurement people were just running around with their hair on fire because they needed to essentially meet the demands of Walmart. So the whole program got restarted, and the procurement people actually put their own teams in place to do this. And that was a very successful effort. And to the extent that after I left GSK, they actually shift primary focus of, which was a little unfortunate, but nonetheless, they recognized the value of the supply chain. So that was a positive outcome. Now, as I said, review of supply chains for different products can be difficult. It's sometimes hard to draw the line, differentiate, which is the supply chain, which is manufacturing, depending on the product. If you're in a company, it's probably easier because you make that demarcation. It's somewhat arbitrary, but nonetheless, that demarcation is made. And this usually distribution, customer, consumer, and off you go. However, the reality is very different. And I saw it clearly in my own experience. We would have, let's say, half a dozen to 12 different intermediates before we had an active pharmaceutical ingredient. Well, those intermediates literally crisscrossed the globe, depending on who had the expertise to make a particular synthetic step. So as a result, materials would move from Europe to China, to India, back to Europe, back to China for final processing sometimes, or over to the US for final processing, around quite a bit. And of course, you also have a situation where, obviously the customers are global naturally. So you have that same sort of movement throughout. You also have different metrics in terms of what you're trying to do. And these metrics obviously have different objectives. For some, you're trying to assess what's happening, and others, you're trying to diagnose the problem. And the base, of course, you're always trying to correct some problems. And each one of them has its own objective in terms of what you're trying to do in order to manage your supply chain. And of course, you have operational, transactional, and organizational. The goal of operational, of course, is to eliminate parts flow waste. So you really want to reduce that waste. This is sort of what we're trying to accomplish. Transactional is integrating delivery. Organizational is assuring customer satisfaction. But the bottom line, again, is to eliminate waste, reduce variability, improve the quality, increase flexibility. Now, that is that you have to view quality as an essential component of your industrial ecology effort, because if you have poor quality, you'll just naturally generate a lot of reject materials, a lot of waste. And so without good quality, you have a really uphill battle dealing with the objective of eliminating waste. So another example, of course, you have materials that go, again, from different parts of China to Long Beach, and of course to other spots. So you have from Europe, it's Germany to Amsterdam to Florida, and then on to Texas. And then of course go to Fort Worth. But this is just an example of different options you have. Now, the fundamental question is, what's the company's ethical responsibility to improve the supply chain? And again, this gets at the essence of what we're trying to do with industrial ecology. We want to go in there and make sure that every step in the life cycle is done with the greatest efficiency. This, of course, depends on fiduciary responsibility. If you believe your fiduciary responsibility is strictly limited to the company's bottom line, which it usually is, but that it doesn't extend to the supply chain, you have one approach. However, I think, and this is what I think what Walmart did, they recognized their fiduciary responsibility is driving that program, sustainability, into the supply chain to reduce their costs, reduce waste, actually affects their bottom line. And that's why I said in this whole effort of identifying supply chain management, making the process as efficient as possible, I think really is a reflection on the company's fiduciary responsibility. Now, in terms of the background, companies, I think, for a long time have recognized the supply chain are key and critical to their success. It's a critical link. The question usually is, what responsibility do they have to ensure that? Because they buy from a dozen or more different companies, and therefore, you don't have a vested interest in any one company. And of course, in the beginning, with that competition, you have a real drive to lower your costs. And that, of course, was almost it was the only driving metric for how you manage your supply chain, how procurement managed the supply chain, was lower your costs. But then it got a little bit more sophisticated. Usually the chief financial officer would come down to procurement and say, listen, you're killing me with your inventory, buy in bulk. So you would buy not just for the next month, you might buy for the next 6 months. And what that meant, of course, was the company was holding an inventory on its books, robbing them of that financial benefit. So, and it was Toyota, I believe, who first came up with the idea of having their suppliers provide them with the materials that they needed for that day's production. So it was literally just-in-time delivery. They wanted suppliers to essentially affect a different approach. And that, as far as the chief financial officer was concerned, he or she didn't have to hold that cost on their books, which was, I think, a good thing. But with that, of course, there was almost a drive for shrinking transport times. So literally things went from boats back to airplanes to make sure that that would be almost a guaranteed delivery. And all of those things allowed for, again, a quicker reaction to business challenges. However, alongside that was the increased environmental significant consumer pressure. Customers wanted eco-friendly products. And so therefore, supply chain sustainability became a new measure of logistics management. And that's understandable because what we found is a sustainable supply chain means a profitable supply chain. And historically, companies usually limited sustainability to their operations, and they were almost unwilling, not just unable, but unwilling to extend that evaluation to their suppliers and customers. In many cases, it's a point of competitive advantage. So they were really trying to determine how that drove into the supply chain. Now, you can mandate that, but usually those mandates come at certain costs. So you have these conflicting problems for the procurement managers. So now, of course, what's happened is a lot of progress has been made in terms of defining supply chain sustainability and identifying the right tools and metrics that help those things to say you can't keep the supply chain at arm's length. That in order to be successful, many of the suppliers aren't necessarily at the level of sophistication as the primary purchaser, the big companies, certainly the big multinationals. So therefore, there was an understanding that there had to be some level of collaboration. And it can be at a very simple level. One of those was just the question of transport. Trucks, boats, planes would go out full and come back empty. Well, it was half of that step was completely worthless. And so they recognized that there was this flow of parts and goods that essentially would optimize the use of transport. The other, of course, was alternative modes of transport. And that's the use of water and rail as opposed to air and truck. As I said before, the just-in-time process really was an exercise in making sure you delivered that product just when manufacturing needed that component. Personally, I had a real battle with our procurement people and said, look, you can still do that. You just have to be a little bit more thoughtful about when you put that on the train, when you put it in the ship. So you can still do that over a couple of weeks as long as you ship your material several weeks before the manufacturing people need it. It's a little bit trickier because sometimes you'll have market demand that varies. But nonetheless, usually that was not in the context of days, but rather weeks and sometimes months. We started to see those shifts, and everybody down the line can essentially accommodate that as long as you have good communication systems. Just briefly, as a supplier versus a contract manufacturer, and this is fundamentally different. A contract manufacturer is a company that takes your process and uses it to make your component of your product. And as a result, you have a lot more control, a lot more impact. Sometimes it's just freeing up the capital of building that facility, or it's a question of expertise in many cases. You may have a particular skill in a particular process, especially different processing technologies. And so therefore, if you have a particularly tricky process, you can turn that over to a contract manufacturer. The risks, of course, there are labor issues. They can have problems. They can essentially upend your program. You have some employee risks. If you're not careful, you need to make sure that their employees are protected. You have environmental risks. You have to then make sure that they treat the byproducts from environmental way. And therefore, some companies have actually gone, once those things are addressed, they will outsource all their manufacturing. They just don't want to deal with it. They see themselves as a sales and marketing effort organization. So that's all out there. And it does create a certain level of risk because you don't have direct control. Now, supply chain itself, market availability, again, as I said before, it's commodity, so it's generally available. Your manufacturing is the value added step. Supply chain, because they have some hazardous materials. You'll keep the ones that are safer and outsource those steps that use the hazardous materials. And that's another use of contract manufacturing. Usually the best step here is to look at alternative processes that essentially convert those hazardous steps, those hazardous materials, to non-hazardous. And in many cases that can be done. And that, of course, is the essence of the other thing you're trying. Now, obviously you have different decisions you have to come about. You want to make some national claims, made in the USA. Unfortunately, people get around that by having all the supply, all the manufacturing, except for the very last step made overseas. The last step is made in the US. The other, of course, is the environmental costs. Sometimes the intermediates can generate significant waste loads. You don't want that as part of your profile. And also you don't want that in countries that you do business just because of environmental regulation. So companies have shipped it off. It's best for ethical companies by having internal standards that say they're not going to have different levels of environmental controls elsewhere. And again, some of this is addressed through the optimization of process to eliminate waste. And of course, the others is the issues in terms of the risk to the employees. The hazardous nature of the compounds. You're putting, want to put your employees at risk, but you put someone else's employees at risk. And again, same way, an ethical company will essentially endeavor to have programs whereby the employees of your company subjected to differential risks, but they'll all be equally protected. Now, of course, this has been a problem in the past. We see with Nike, Foxconn, Tasing, there have human rights issues where both slave labor and child labor is certainly used. You have to be thoughtful in terms of what your supply chain does. And some of that requires some visibility. In the beginning, I think most kind of suppliers, but when you think about it, a lot of operations will have audits of quality. And so the argument that I think needs to go forward is that if we can have people on site in the supply chain to deal with quality, we should be able to have auditors on site dealing with employee health and safety and well-being. And it's almost just as equally important. And of course, there really should be a good relationship between the EHS programs and the quality programs. And that's one way to deal with that. The other, of course, is to have consortium for multiple companies. Tasing is a good example. When you have clothing manufacturers that are suppliers provide clothes for a range of different buyers. Those buyers can consolidate their efforts in a consortium and have an overview to ensure that the Tasing fire does not happen again. Environmental compliance. All these things really came into contact with our legal department. The point being is that if you started to inject yourself in the supply chain, do you then also own the risks? And of course, the answer should be no. It's a question of how you manage it, but really what you're trying to enhance and improve their performance. And of course, the other question is at what point will the hazardous waste from those supply chain operations come back to haunt you? I mean, we saw that in the US with Superfund. We used to contract for the disposal of waste in a way that essentially eliminated any risks back to the originating company. Well, Superfund completely overrode that and essentially said, if you it's possible that same argument could be made for the hazardous waste of the supply chain. Bhopal, of course, is a good example where thousands of people were killed by it wasn't a fully owned subsidiary of Union Carbide, but nonetheless, they took the responsibility, were given the responsibility, and it ultimately led to the demise of that company. So it is a operational threat if you're not careful. So how do you deal with that? Again, to make sure that those environmental controls, the process safety control, you clearly want to avoid all of these types of problems. So the other question that comes up, why not move the supply chain to the US? There are high labor costs, but labor costs are increasing. And sometimes they're lower material costs at the point of origin. So if this material is being shipped around the world, the transport issue may overcome it. And it was one of the things that we did. I used to track the labor costs in India and China because we were outsourcing a lot of our materials there. And labor costs in those countries, plus transport, actually overwhelmed the costs in Europe or the costs in the US. And so it's just a question of then making that calculation and making a determination based on that. Regulation, of course, in many cases, the supply chains are more cooperative governments. They don't necessarily hold the proverbial feet to the fire with respect to environmental regulations. And that's something that has to be addressed if you're going to bring it back. A component of globalization that was almost identified as philanthropy. And that is that it was outsourced to those countries as a means to enhance their standard of living. It provided jobs, provided educational opportunities, different skill sets, and that was seen much more positively. And of course, if you bring that back to the US, there'll be a similar benefit, ironically, here for the US, but there will be a concern about undermining the efforts that have been made so far in those developing countries. The other, of course, is the markets that's related to assumed cost reduction. And I mentioned before that we would track the labor costs in different countries. And we found what the break-even point was. The problem was the market lagged that particular effort. And so that while we could have moved production back to Europe, production back to the US, the market, again, the stock market, wouldn't see that positively because they assumed that all outsourcing essentially reflected cost reduction. And so therefore, we might actually be penalized, even though it had a relatively positive economic benefit to us. So Reverse logistics really is about trying to recover your waste material after it's been consumed, not strictly relying on the, if you will, the marketplace to ensure you have recycling, but you actually put it in place. Now, in the EU, the Waste Directive requires companies to go out and have an active, proactive recovery program. And some, again, trade associations will hire a company called PROS, which go out, which again is proactive recycling organizations. So that is part and parcel of the reverse logistics program in the EU. In the US, Interface, of course, is a good example of that, where they would literally almost rent the rugs that they would put in. Once they were worn, they would come back, recover those tiles because they were put in squares, reprocess them, and then essentially out of that recovered material, generate new rugs. So reverse logistics really is the active effort of the manufacturer to recover the used product. Ribena was a good example. We wanted to create, it was a black currant drink in the UK. We wanted to create a bottle that was 100% recycled material. So in order to do that, we actually had to go into the marketplace and specifically have programs that would allow for differentiation. It was a radio frequency identification device, an RFID, was placed on each and every bottle that allowed us to essentially sort plastic bottles in a way that we were able to recover Ribena bottles only, break them down and remold them to make new Ribena bottles. So those are all very positive. And again, supply chain returns management. This is the complexity that I think we need to think about with respect to the circular economy. How you're going to work that in, how it impacts the extraction process. But weaving that in is not going to be necessarily a simple task. So of course, with that is not just a question of reliance on, again, commercial recovery operations. Companies probably will have to go, and you're starting to see signs of this more and more, where companies are starting to proactively go into the marketplace to recover it. The process itself can be innovative and it can be very efficient. So you have, again, these countercurrent flows of both products to consumers and, of course, the wasted product, if you will, the consumed product that goes back to recovery and reuse. And again, you have a new look at a product life cycle from this one. This is, of course, from the Reverse Logistics Association, where you have forward logistics, which essentially is the development of the product. And then you have a reverse logistics, which is aftermarket customer service, ensuring that people understand that the product can either be repaired and reused, or at the end of the day, if the customer really doesn't want it anymore, it's something that can be very easily done by the customer to reintroduce. This takes the form of some type of credit for buying a new product if they're unwilling or unable to rehabilitate and recover the existing product. So reverse logistics certainly is linked to product stewardship, where there's an active involvement from the manufacturer, the distribution, and the consumer, which is really the US model, or extended producer responsibility, which is the EU model, which says the manufacturer has responsibilities for the recovery and reuse or disposal of the final product, which essentially drives the design of that product, going right back to product design issues. It is clearly a business issue. It can affect the organizational supply chain. It also impacts logistics network. As I said before, it's both forward and returns. And so therefore it will be essential to deliver long-term profitability. I said it's replaced. It probably has enhanced the focus on cost, value, and speed, but it has become the dominant topic of discussion in procurement. The tiers of supply chain sustainability: one, you get the basic goals properly. Then you need to learn sustainability. You need to think it through the whole organization. It has to be part of the fabric of what you're doing. So you see it in terms of supply, you see it in terms of manufacturing and distribution. And of course, you have to understand the science of sustainability to get the right metrics, the right auditing programs, the right benchmarks. And it does give some clarity on what you're trying to do, because you're able to cover this area with the proper information, proper metrics, that allows for dashboard reporting that gives companies a very clear overview of what they're able to do. And again, as a business strategy, it does deliver a lot of benefits. It can reduce reputation, and therefore it can enhance your shareholder value. It also can contribute to economic and social development. Again, not just the developing world, but the developed world. And therefore it can create higher standards of living for millions of people, hopefully achieving the Sustainable Development Goal of the UN, #1, of eliminating poverty. This is a component of that, perhaps. So widespread concerns about the poor social and environmental conditions. And most companies see that outside of their core competencies or their responsibilities. Public scrutiny has driven it. There is rising expectation. If you don't do this properly, it certainly can undermine any gains you might otherwise have. Corporate buying practices can impact supplier ability to improve their conduct. Now, the counter to that, the problem is that sometimes pressure on cost and efficiency will force suppliers to cut corners. And you want to make sure you have the right balance in there so as not to create that particular problem. So therefore, you want to use your purchasing power to instill good practices. Usually by if a number of suppliers have bad practices, you shun them, you stay with them and go with the ones that are more positive. So you have to think beyond short-term financial considerations sometimes and look at the long-term benefit. And this, of course, helps incorporate sustainability into the supply chain so that it becomes a real driver in terms of spreading corporate citizenship around the world. The UN has 10 principles in the compact, and they've taken those 10. Some are more difficult than others, but what they've done essentially from most companies, most responsible multinationals did just that. But then the UN came back and said, all right, as long as you're willing to do that, can you then encourage your supply chain to deal with these same 10 best practices? Now, companies lack the knowledge and capacity, so therefore the primary companies had to then be the ones that assisted in that collaboration I mentioned before. And in ways that they saw supply chain sustainability as something that works wonders in terms of the big four global compact issues of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. So you certainly recognize that your risks are better anticipated. So there are advantages, not just doing it independently, but also working with the UN in this area. The business case, of course, it does enhance your license to operate because both governments, communities, and legal systems will be more supportive of your efforts in this area. Reduce costs, you'll have issues around enhanced efficiency and productivity, and you can certainly improve working conditions for those employees in your supply chain, but generally helps reduce turnover and improves the quality and reliability of your product. So there's a real win-win-win on this one. The business case, of course, environmental responsibility, certainly from an industrial ecology standpoint, is that you develop a certain reputation in terms of enhancing your brand and reflecting that brand with your values. You have process and product innovation that essentially tries to identify not just the process of enhancing it, but it also enhances perhaps a effort in developing more sustainable products. And it provides examples for a number of people in terms of what companies can do in this regard. Now, in all of this, a thing that drives a lot of the effort. It's not as if in many cases the answer exists out there. In many circumstances, you have to be willing to do a little bit of effort and innovate and do some research to achieve this. Sourcing decisions where low cost isn't the only factor, still critical, but again, recognizing that all these things are interconnected. And embedded water, of course, is the other where you're moving water from a water-rich region to a water-scarce. And of course, conversely, you don't want to create a situation where you're manufacturing a product in a water recipe for disaster across the board for everybody. So what are the benefits? Reduce risks, reduce costs, enhanced reputation, and a reduction in the disruption of supplies, which again goes right back to the issue of risk. So the question is going to be, how do you change the process? How do you manage compliance and maintain compliance? And what companies are out there that attempted to change their supply chain. What you want to do is a little bit of benchmarking that allows you to understand what companies have done and see if you can build on that, and not just adopt it full scale, but also adopt it. So what influences the adoption of circular economy in the supply chain? Sometimes government guidance can do that, although I think the best government guidance that's provided is one of transparency. Once you can see what others have done successfully, companies are more willing to adopt that. Consumer demand is important. If the consumers are asking for it, that's helpful, but it's not sufficient in of itself. Again, usually the idea is that customers and consumers would want to essentially create that product and show them the benefits of that particular approach. Enhanced efficiencies, of course, are the essence of industrial ecology, trying to eliminate waste, therefore reducing costs. And of course, reducing your risk on the supply chain. And it's not just issues around civil disruption, labor unrest. It can be issues around just the very availability of a particular resource because it's been exhausted. So here you have Walmart, of course, working with their supply chain, driving it into the program. They've established state paid for their hours. Labor is voluntary, of course. You want to comply with child labor laws, slavery laws. Working hours aren't excessive, and there are risk-based audits. One of the things that Walmart did in terms of this is to actually have a cascade where they would put these audit programs in place, but then they would have an obligation for that supplier to cascade that same requirement down to their suppliers. So the 6 elements of their supply chain was to manage risk, to reduce the standards, have responsible sourcing, provide education within the context of collaborating. So the idea is that Walmart or any company would help their suppliers do these things. So they saw this in a very positive way. They created their own drivers. And of course, part of this was, and I talked with Lee Scott in a conference once where he said this was their exercise in trying to initially deal with public relations. But what they found was it really was aligned with their goals, their objectives, and their values. And so therefore, they have identified sustainability that essentially is sustainable. Again, all of these things are exercises that we need to commit to in terms of implementing industrial ecology principles. And I talked before about their backstory. They had a number of different metrics to ensure that they would be able to minimize these problems. They wanted to make sure that their executives worked with suppliers. They wanted products that were energy efficient, packaging efficient, and making sure that they used non-hazardous materials, such as with fertilizers. The head of their programs said it was an investment to make sure the supply chain becomes more profitable. They developed a sustainability index. They created a sustainability consortium that helps both retailers and suppliers in all these areas to make sure that customers understand why they were doing it, and they would create brands that they would essentially support. They had climate change initiatives. They had, of course, renewable energy targets. They had a number of different requirements that they sent off to their staff. Material efficiency was part and parcel of that. Natural resources were in there. People and communities were on that. And so therefore, Walmart had a rather comprehensive approach to essentially actually embedding industrial ecology programs. One of the things they haven't done yet, and we'll have to wait and see, is how they implement their principles on circular economy. And that's essentially things that we need to think about. Supply chain in terms of agriculture, they're focused on local versus global. It does relate to climate change. It's meant to inform customer decisions. And of course, we're going organic help. If supplies can be provided for all people in the world, it would be positive, but it may not necessarily be sufficient in that regard. The thing that probably will better help issues around food and sustainable agriculture is to minimize the waste. The amount of food waste that is substantial. Usually about a third of the food that's generated is actually wasted. So that can be sufficient. Supply, again, going back through a discussion of supply chain is really define your supply chain. If you're dealing with different metals, it's the processing after extraction that essentially defines your supply chain. If you have complex products, it is the discrete units in that product, where manufacturing is the assembly of those supplied parts. Supply chain, of course, you have to look at sea, rail, truck, and air, and you have to recognize that they each have a different, certainly sea and rail being much more energy efficient in terms of ton miles of transport. Supply chain, just to again reinforce the issue, cost, just-in-time quality were all drivers in the past. Sustainability now has been added to that. And so therefore, you have the whole issue of trying to incorporate that on a global basis. And to answer the rhetorical question I provided at the bottom of this, usually that's controlled by having that cascading process that I mentioned before. Having one company try to go down through the tiers becomes less than an impossibility. It really becomes. There is an ethical responsibility to improve the supply chain, to bring in components of industrial ecology and the circular economy in there. You want to influence your suppliers to be sustainable. The benefits, of course, are apparent to the supplier as well as to you. Food miles become an issue of both lack of waste, minimizing waste or eliminating waste, and also energy. And of course, the battle between supply chain and US is out there in terms of whether you globalize the supply chain or bring it all local. And that's going to be a debate and a battle that's going to continue for quite some time. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in class. Take care. Bye now.